I want to thank everybody for joining us for Astrix's live webinar today entitled From R&D to Manufacturing, Leveraging ELNs for Bioprocessing Success. Today's presentation is going to be presented by Brendan McCorkle, CEO of SciNote, and Luke Cach, Sales Director at Ganymede. My name is Kevin Miller with Astrix, and I'm going to MC today's session, and I'm going to obviously sit back and enjoy some of the materials myself. We'll go to the next slide, and if you haven't been involved in any Astrix webinars to date, we welcome you. If you're coming back to an Astrix webinar and you've been to others, we thank you for coming back. I'll take a moment and tell you a little bit about who Astrix is as a company, and then I'll introduce our speakers. So we are a consulting firm. You can go to the previous slide. We're a consulting firm, and we typically work with technology vendors like the two you're going to hear from today. We've been doing this for over 25 years, and we help companies in a variety of different client sectors, everyone from startups to Fortune 1000, life science enterprises, chemicals, CPG, et cetera. We help them kind of choose the different technologies and build and support those technologies for them. We were established in 1995. We don't align with any particular vendor. We work with a lot of great vendors in the industry. We operate from locations in the United States and overseas, over 1,200 employees, and 90% of which hold advanced science degrees. So we're always proud of that fact. We are very much a science-based company helping science-based companies. We go to the next slide. And then in terms of the services that we bring, so what Astrix likes to say is we do end-to-end service offerings that accelerate digital transformation and optimize performance across your ecosystem. And this could be everything from kind of early stage projects that we work on with companies like strategic innovation and enterprise architecture. This is oftentimes helping companies understand, where they need to get to from a tech stack standpoint. What does that architecture need to look like? And what people and processes they have to have in place in order to make that work. From there, we can help them select services. We can help develop and implement those solutions. We could do the computer systems validation and even ongoing application support well after the fact. We could even take it as far as if you need help with staffing, we can even staff both IT as well as scientific personnel. So again, a very broad breadth of services that we bring to bear when we work with life science companies. So that's just a little bit about Astrix. If you didn't know who we were already, we're very glad to have you here with us today. Now I'll take a moment and introduce our speakers for today. We can go to the next slide, please. So we have Brendan McCorkle, he's the CEO of SciNote, and Luke Cach, the Sales Director of Ganymede. Brendan, better part of the last 15 years or so, has been working in technology. He started and grown multiple investor-backed businesses, raised over $20 million in venture capital, negotiated and managed technology transfer out of a $2 billion healthcare system. I'll let you kind of read through his bio all you want, but a great deal of work in the tech space on Brendan's part. So we're thrilled to have him. I can't wait to hear what he has to talk about today. And Luke has over a decade experience in the biopharma industry. Background lends itself to digital and business transformation. He's a trained bioprocess engineer. So we're thrilled to have Luke with us as well. With that, I'm going to turn the controls over to Luke, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation. I'll be back on at the end to help with questions.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Kev. I hope everyone can hear me. And I think just before we start jumping in, directly into speaking to the ELNs and their role in this discussion, I do want to kick things off by talking just a little bit about the space really between research and manufacturing, just so that we have a bit of better context for understanding the challenges that are encountered in this area, which is development, because I think very often we tend to lump R&D together, when in reality, they have very distinct functions and they have very distinct priorities. And so by having really a better understanding of the problem space, we can have a more accurately identified goal, right, to aim for what's needed in a solution and the capabilities that can drive success within that area. So with that, I do want to start off just kind of with this slide here, looking at these from high level organizational structure, these three different functions here, research, development, and moving into commercial manufacturing, and looking at kind of like the sliding scale that we're seeing in four different categories here, just to set the tone. And it's obvious that as we're moving down this pipeline, from the very top here, in research, we're really scanning to find different targets that we can go after, as well as different drug candidates that we can take through this pipeline all the way to the end to manufacturing. And the scale shrinks tremendously as we're really screening tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different candidates, and then narrowing that down through development to the few that are actually brought to manufacturing over the years. Alternatively, when we look at the scale of this, research is very much on the small side. We're creating very small quantities. And over time, we're trying to figure out how can we actually create more of this material in a feasible way, ultimately getting it into a robust manufacturing process to create a lot for the patients that are in need. And then when we look at the process itself, which really we're going to be speaking to, I think, quite a bit during this webinar, at the very beginning, research is quite flexible, right? And so there's a lot of dynamics that are moving around that we need to be able to adapt to. But over time, and especially as we get closer to regulatory agencies in that commercial space, those processes need to be locked down, defined, and robust. And the last thing on here, obviously, is cost. So not to say that research is cheap by any means, but as we look at the involvement of, again, regulatory agencies, clinical trials, and just the cost of overall manufacturing and producing the material that we're working on, this cost grows. And so I just want to keep this in context as we think about digital solutions, in particular ELNs, when we move from this research side all the way through development and into commercial manufacturing. So with that said, and from my bio, you probably saw that I have a background within bioprocess engineering, and I have a heavy interest within development. And that's what we're going to kind of focus on, because it is that middle section to bridge research and manufacturing. And I think something that's unique about development is that it houses so many distinct functions. And I will be honest, I'm taking kind of a perspective here of approaching this from more of a larger organization. Very much understandable that within smaller organizations, you might have individuals that overlap here. But the importance of why I want to bring up this, this bit about development housing so many functions is the fact that they have their own unique specific focus areas, but they're very dependent on one another. And by showing this slide, it's not to overwhelm you by having to read the text here of what's going on with all of these arrows, but it is actually to introduce a little bit of this idea that there is not only dependency, but kind of a bit of chaos within development. And the reason is because you have these processes that, again, from the onset of early stage development can be ever-changing, can be very chaotic, are moving back and forth, while you're trying to refine that process as you move through development to lock these down. And when we talk about this dependency on one another, now kind of looking at this figure here and where these arrows are moving, it's because these groups rely on one another, not only to get data back in the case of cell culture and purification here, sending materials to protein analytics or analytical operations, but also for the fact that they have to communicate with one another to understand the context of how their changes affect their colleagues up or downstream, as well as the changes of their colleagues, how they affect one another. And so I think a big part of this, which we'll be talking about, is communication and collaboration. And so when we look at this, right, from the very beginning of early stage development, processes are constantly changing. And part of what that means then is that in relation to the digital tools that are being used, is they may be different across the different groups because their needs are different from one another. And because, again, these processes are changing. So it creates, again, a bit of this chaos in not only the process, but the tools to actually exchange information, which is extremely important, because all of these groups need to be moving at the same pace with one another as they go through the development process to reach their end goal. And so when we think about kind of getting into the challenges here of all the different processes that are changing, of the different tools that are being used, as a result of that, sometimes information can be missed. It might not be found. It isn't accessible by the right groups. And so when we think about the collaboration that has to happen, especially through these digital tools, it should lend itself to speed. But in actuality, many times by adding these digital tools in, it can slow organizations down. So we need to figure out, how do we uncover the right way for these groups to be able to work and speak with one another to move efficiently in their development. Now, I guess one more thing that I really want to kind of touch upon in here as well with these groups is that there are individuals in these groups that also have different priorities. So not only just the different functions, but the people themselves. So their questions and priorities are also going to be ever changing as we move through development, again, from a more flexible kind of mindset, and how we get to clinical trials as fast as possible. How do we actually commercialize this drug and make it manufacturable and then push it off into the commercial manufacturing setting? And so just as a couple examples here, up at the top, right, we have maybe a person who is a director or a team lead. And in a very early stage, they might be thinking of how can we make enough of this product to support clinical trials? How can we make enough to get into clinical trials as fast as possible? However, as we reach more of the late stage, their concerns and their priorities might switch more towards, can our process actually fit what our current manufacturing equipment is spec'd for? Or do we actually need to buy new equipment to fit our facilities? And that's important, especially as you think about maybe manufacturing multiple drugs within the same facility. And so again, it's this ever-changing priority. From a scientist perspective, they might be thinking of how can we use a platform process that's been developed to submit IND in phase 1. Meanwhile, later on, their priorities are going to shift and be thinking about what are the optimal manufacturing process parameters to really ensure the consistency and quality of the drug that's being created. And I think part of this also goes to the data that we're gathering, and again, making this easily findable, accessible, and shareable across these different groups to communicate and collaborate. And it points at fair data. And the reason why I say that is because although these questions and priorities change as we move through the pipeline from early to late stage, we can still use the same data that's been gathered throughout. So it prevents redundancy in experiments, which is time and money. And so it's being able to leverage the tools that we have to properly be able to search, find, share, and communicate all of our data and information and findings with one another, not only at one given time, but really throughout this entire process of bringing a drug to market. And so in the context of these digital solutions, we need systems that are adaptable and encompass enough to support development, again, not just in one stage, but from early through late stage and into manufacturing. So I hope that kind of sets up a little bit of the problem area that we're looking at. And from there, I'm going to hand it off to Brendan.
Thanks, Luke. So there's a lot of organizational shapes and challenges and differences in which piece of this process am I solving by the players on the field. But there's a whole other layer to this. There's also a lot of market forces at play. Okay, next slide. And I think we all know this, but pharma is a high cost, high risk world. What's really interesting over the last couple of years, though, is that there's a little bit of a decrease in R&D productivity. So success rates are not staggeringly high. Only about 13% of assets that enter phase 1 trials go on to launch. In addition, we're talking about everything we're talking about development. This is 60 to 70%, depending on the company, of the whole cost of the whole drug pipeline. So there's lots of little fragments, there's lots of little inconsistencies, and all of those are boundaries for inefficiencies to go through to the net output. But also, the amount of dollars we're spending are going up as an industry, and the FDA isn't approving markedly more drugs per time. So as the R&D spending is going up and the output is staying the same, this actually means efficiency is going down. This force is pushing on the system that we just talked about. Next slide. Simultaneously, it's getting harder to fill clinical trials. The ease of having a full trial is going down, and actually the length of time that they're taking is going up. So McKinsey did a study where between 2011 and 2015, and between 2016 and 2021, the average clinical trial lengthened from 41 to 44 months for phase 3 trials, and 37 to 41 for phase 2 trials. And also, maybe more alarming than this, about 80% of clinical trials fail to finish on time. So we're starting to box in an ever-growing need for efficiency here in a pretty complicated shape. And maybe the last market point of this is, if these things are getting harder and they're costing more and they're slowing down, what's at stake? And what's at stake, if you go to the next slide, is the ultimate goal is to get the drug to market, but it's really to get the drug to market first. And what I found really interesting, as does my dog, sorry, is that the first to market, if it's by more than a year, carries 6 market points for market share advantage over later entrants up to a full decade later. That's pretty powerful. For 10 years, 6 market points. These are usually publicly traded companies. These are big numbers. Second really interesting learning here, the second to market penalty is actually nominal if it's less than a year. So if there's a race here, you need to not only win, but you need to win by more than a year to carry the advantage of it, or you might as well be second and have the time efficiency of being second if you're a close second. Huge variance in which specialty this is, and some in certain areas, specialty biologics, for example, that advantage is actually 12 or 13 points, and then in others it's less important. So very, very big difference. You know, just sort of academically as a student of the market, really interesting that third place is punished much more than second or fourth or fifth, and then, you know, sixth and more. It's too many ways to split the pie, and it gets really rough. So if this has a pharma company with 3 to 5 investigational drugs entering human studies every year, going 12 months faster across that portfolio translates to more than $400 million in net present value for the sponsor. And this is also, we do this because it gets to humans eventually. So this also accelerates time to patients. So this is good for patients and families. So I think that this is, you know, we have real money at stake here, in addition to all of the other complexities of development. So this sort of rounds out the shape that Luke started. Next slide. And I think tees up really the heart of the problem, which is, if science is organized knowledge, and we can hop to the next one, then why is this our foundation? What you're looking at is Marie Curie. I love showing this in her notebook, as well as a modern lab, also with a paper notebook. So we are supposed to put a dent in the shape that Luke and I just drew for you, with something that might be the opposite of fair data. You have to find the actual book. You have to go to the right page. How do you collaborate with this, right? Close to half of science is still done on paper. That's nuts. we got to start here. And maybe the second most offensive is how hard we lean on Excel, but that might be a whole other webinar. So next slide. So the burden of not using tools, or using the current tools and the rigidity, the methods that we use for collaboration, this is 15 to 25% of a scientist's time. This is copying data, this is pasting, this is editing, losing data, finding it, sharing it with colleagues, pasting things into an email, repasting it back into a notebook or whatever you're using instead. These things are hard to find. They're hard to access. Interoperability, the I of FAIR is a joke when we're starting here. This time is for one scientist. That organizational breakdown that Luke gave might be 200 people in a process group at a larger company. Every single one of these having this lag. And then we're trying to set the bar at, can we do this, you know, 1 year faster across our portfolio? Not if we're chasing it that way. Next slide. The other thing that's compounding this, to maybe beat this one more time, is that the pressure on the amount of stuff we're working with is accelerating. Scientific data is doubling output every couple of years. This might be lower than 3 now, actually. Close to half, just over half of studies can't be verified, and we're losing a ton of scientific data every year. Repeated studies or the lack of verification of the studies are one of the biggest sources of drag, other than not being able to find the data. There's also you have to, when you introduce other groups who are waiting on your results, you also have the system. If you remember the graph with the looped arrows, you might be waiting for someone in another group before you can do yours. So this is another place where that compounds. So it's bad, it's not solved elegantly, and it's getting worse. This is really the other side of the scale of trying to show up early for our clinical trial and have that first mover advantage. So we can go to the next one. And to keep this tied back to today, maybe to tip our hand a little bit that the answer is collaboration, the need for this is the highest in development, and that's why we're really focusing on the D of R&D. So we need, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not just that the collaboration need is high. We have all of these fronts for data to fall in between. We have all of these places to come out of alignment with our peers and our colleagues. This is also carrying about 70% of the cost in the drug pipeline. So it should have our attention as where we should be working on the machine. And then I think we maybe have one more slide here to put this back up. If this, Luke, is what's behind us when we're talking about problems with collaboration, problems with our tools, I wanted to make sure we had time to talk a little bit, both of us. So now we've set the stage. We have this mess behind us, and we're trying to take as much slack out of the line as we can. What do we do?
Yeah, and I think when we reach this point, right, we're talking about collaboration and really the opportunity of speed to get to market faster. And again, this leans back to communication by collaborating. And so again, looking at this slide, as we view this and all the different processes that are going on here and all the different groups that are working with one another, it's really that necessity of ensuring that all of the individuals have access to information, and not just the information, but context. And so bringing this back to solutions like ELNs, right? Ensuring that there is that accessibility so that there's the quickness of communication for different users and different engineers and scientists to find the answers that they need to move on to their next step. And one of the biggest things I would say from my own personal time within development while I was at Genentech, and this is nothing negative towards the groups that I worked with, right? But by having so many different tools, turnaround time. As a bioprocess engineer, I'm submitting samples to be to find results from different assays that they're being submitted for. And if there is clunkiness throughout this entire process and not being able to access the data, whether that's through ELN or other tools, then I can't move on to my next step, my next advancement to push a certain product through the development pipeline. And so that's where the criticality really comes in around this collaboration and ease of collaboration by implementing the right digital tools and ELNs to make sure that we're not preventing the speed of getting to market, but rather being able to improve and enhance it.
What I hear when we talk about this is that there's a promise that's been made to all of us in life sciences of digitization. And what it feels like is what we're talking about is the honest assessment of this is we haven't realized this state. And so there's some stuff in the way. So to fully realize this, to actually be following FAIR standards, it's easy to be cheeky here. The F in FAIR is findable. Well, are you actually chasing down somebody's book? Where's the notebook? Is it in the lab? Is it at the bench? How do you accessible? How do you access that? Can you do it from home? Can you do it from another office? A lot of these companies are multinational. Interoperable. What happens when they add a new piece of software? Is everything a hard reset on every workflow? Well, that doesn't sound like we're moving forward. So these are all candidates for things that could get better if they're digital. And there's certainly a couple of things that we like to pick on our peers about in this lane. One of them is, the eye of interoperability. If a vendor doesn't have an API, they've essentially said, we don't believe in the eye. So I think this is an easy, quick sort when we think about how should we solve our way out of this. Findable and accessible gets a little bit interesting because we have this spectrum that Luke showed you guys a little bit earlier. Not only do we have the nonlinearity of what you're looking at in front of you right now, but we also have this spectrum from fully structured data, sorry, I had that backwards, from fully unstructured data to fully structured data. So I want to step through that one too. I think both of our companies bring an interesting perspective to this. So if you look at the purest research and creativity, you know, the best ELN for a research lab might actually be a blank piece of paper, a Google Doc, just fully unstructured, complete openness, right? The more you bound this, the more you limit the creativity. You probably don't want that in research. This is the stuff of nightmares in manufacturing, though. So as we move from the ideation to the screening of a finite set, even if it's 10,000, like Luke showed you, a finite set of molecules or compounds, into we think it's these 10, can we do them at scale? Do we have the right quality? Are they safe? Let's go. We have to be moving in all of these loops and across that spectrum. This is really hard to do as a vendor because fully structured data is pretty easy. Fully unstructured data is also pretty easy, but we have to do both. So curious in your role, either experiencing these solutions as a scientist or in your roles, you know, from Benchling Synthase or currently at Ganymede, how you feel about sort of this tension between having both structured and unstructured data playing nicely together.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think actually it's more of a kind of the wider view as well of just kind of looking at how those relate to the entire development process of moving from early to late stage. So I would say that as much as possible, it's important to get things into a structured format because that makes it findable and searchable and more easily accessible by your colleagues as they need to find that important information. Now, that being said, as I mentioned at the very beginning and kind of setting all of this up, when we move into early stage, things are very dynamic. And there is a lot of chaos that's going on. And so processes and workflows may not be locked down. What that means is that it's also harder to put into place this structured data. And so what I would say is, as much as possible when leveraging and setting up systems like an ELN and other digital solutions, it's important to try to provide some type of backbone and some consistently, at least from the get-go, of what you know you're searching for, what kind of information needs to be passed from one group to another, but allow the flexibility for these processes to change within that digital solution. And then obviously, as you get closer and closer to late stage development, is how do we start to actually lock down certain workflows? So now we want to add in some rigidity, and maybe that means templatizing certain runs, certain aspects of the development process. Maybe it means that you're creating more SOPs. And that can be done within this digital space and within ELNs. But I think, again, looking at this span, again, from beginning to end, it's important to recognize that you need to have the flexibility and the opportunity for that up front while still making it easily accessible and findable for everyone within the organization, and then be able to actually have the rigidity later on. So you need a dynamic solution that can span kind of this whole portion, especially as we think about moving into manufacturing, because at that point then we really need to make sure that everything is locked down in a very formal process.
Agreed. And it's a very interesting spectrum to carry inside an organization, from essentially the opposite of fully locked down all of the way to fully locked down. I think there's some themes, if you think about collaboration, which we've talked a lot about today, that in its purest form, you need a couple of things to be collaborative, and they resonate with some of the things that we're talking about from vendors and the needs of our customers. But to be on a high functioning team, you need a couple of things. You need a unity of purpose. You need situational awareness, and potentially, especially where there's regulatory environment, you need a record of the decisions and actions that were taken, right? And so at its heart, you can get pretty far with putting those three things in. So you need to be able to pursue, what are we trying to do? We're actually trying to identify a molecule out of that 10,000, right? So you have teammates who are taking that number from 10,000 down to 10, say. People need to know whether that work has happened, is happening, what it's gated by. And the closer you get to manufacturing, the more important we need to know that it did actually happen, or especially if there were adverse effects. So these sort of pull out some functional units that software should have in order to realize the promise of the fair data standards, right? So you have to be able to see your colleagues. You have to be able to link things to your colleagues. You have to have awareness of what they've done. You need to have audit logs of all the things that have happened, especially the closer you get to a GXP environment. What else do we need to do as we try to move into the solution space to make sure collaboration actually realizes its potential?
I think one of the biggest things is standardization, in all honesty. And again, I know that this kind of goes back to that this juxtaposition between early and late stage.
Mm-hmm.
But being able to, it's more of operational standards, ensuring that the groups know how they are going to be communicating with one another, knowing which solutions are housing which information, because that really gets at the heart of how do you find the data that's necessary to work with each other and to move forward. Because again, from my perspective, that is what has tripped up most timelines that I've seen. Is the data may even be there, it's just not knowing where to look. And so back to this thought of standardization, it's making sure that organizationally, when we're using these tools, and again, specifically thinking about ELNs, it is very well defined what is going to be placed within the ELN and how that information is going to be shared, not just within a team, but within an entire functional group, so that everyone knows exactly where they can access information that they need to move forward.
This reminds me, the conversation about standards is there's one of my favorite examples of the tension between structured and unstructured data. It makes me think of two things. One of them, you could probably have a standard for default output from an ELN. So if you were to import it into other systems, or if you had a location, and this happens a lot, folks, where people are rolling more than one ELN, how do you unify that data? Well, in our ELN, for example, we define an information hierarchy of experiments and projects and tasks. Those mean a certain thing to us. They don't necessarily mean the same thing to you. And we have a lot of people who ask us, could we rename those? We really think project and task are inverted. That's how our lab works. And there's tension for us to move into the workflow of our customers. It's sort of part of our mission of being a workflow-centric tool, right? But if we take the label of the information hierarchy and we make it dynamic, we make the mapping problem downstream way more complicated, because now an experiment isn't an experiment is an experiment. It might be an experiment, it might be a procedure somewhere else, and it might be a potato at a lab who's really cheeky, right? So how do you combine all of those into nice, clean data for analysis downstream? It gets really hard. But there's this trade-off between that flexibility, especially as you're developing methods and procedures. You might not know what to name them. And so this is a place where those two meet and actually oppose. Someone has to win this tension. So if we could all collectively agree that these are the three hierarchies, this could map into something as straightforward as the .xlsx, the Excel format, file format, right? Or a .txt file, where you expect that to be a bundle of those three hierarchies. But that requires concessions from the users and from the vendors to do that.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, again, all of this kind of comes back to, again, with the agreement that you're speaking of, comes back to this idea of collaboration, because it all goes back to this team effort. Everyone is on board, and it's the speed at which collaboration can enable that gets us to our end goal here. With that, I think we'll move on just to this last portion here. Brendan, I don't mean to cut you off by any means, but I want to welcome Kevin back to the table as well.
You beat my timer by 30 seconds, so perfect timing.
Perfect timing. Thanks. Great presentation. Obviously, very compelling content. We'll do a couple things here real quick. One, I want to make sure that we get, at least on the recording side of the fence, so folks know if you have questions, you know where to go for those questions. So we've got some contact information up here for everybody.